Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. It is 3 o'clock according to my daughter's. I'm borrowing my daughter's iWatch, and it's pink. And if you want to come make a comment, be my guest. I'm Jim White. I'm the moderator for this panel. And we have, this is a panel on, what's it called? Freedom of speech on campus. Yes. Free speech on campus. Sorry. I knew I had exact words. I'm going to introduce both speakers, and this is the format we're going to have. There's going to be 12 minutes each for opening statements, and then 6 minutes for responses, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So you can, at that point, I will read to you, right before the Q&A, I'll read for you instructions on questions and answers, but I assume you are veterans of CWA and you have some idea of how to do that. So, but right before the Q&A, I'll make that announcement. So I'd like to get started. Milou Innocent is an adjunct scholar to Cato Institute. She was a foreign policy analyst at Cato from 2007 to 2013. She is a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and her primary research interests include Middle East and Persian Gulf security issues, and U.S. foreign policy towards Pakistan, Afghanistan, and China. With Ted Galen Carpenter, she's the author of Perilous Partners, The Benefits and Pitfalls of America's Alliances with Authoritarian Regimes. Milou, welcome. Our other panelist today is Ian Milhiser. Ian is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress and the Justice Editor for Think Progress. Among other things, he clerked for Judge Eric L. Clay of the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit and served as a Teach for America Corps member in the Mississippi Delta. He received a BA in philosophy from Kenyon College and a JD from Duke University, where he served as senior note editor on the Duke Law Journal and was elected to the Order of the Coif. He is the author of Injustices, the Supreme Court's History of Comforting the Comfortable and Afflicting the Afflicted.
Available where all books are sold.
Available where all books are sold. Milou.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Great, thank you all for coming. The First Amendment extends to public colleges and universities, protecting the faculty, the students, and their speech, and their invited guests. Freedom of speech has consequences, and advocates for equality have the right to protest the spread of hateful ideas. I will argue that those who support anti-racist activism and applaud shift in norms that embrace equality should also be troubled that in our quest for inclusivity, we exclude legitimate opinions, sensible discussion, and the robust protection for equality. The first claim is that we lack objective criteria for what speech to suppress. Now, college students, far from their depiction as radical authoritarians or pearl-clutching snowflakes, when polled in a 2016 Gallup and Knight survey, 72% say colleges should not be able to restrict speech expressing political views. However, 69% say colleges should be allowed to prohibit language that, quote, intentionally offensive and to certain groups, and 63% say colleges should be allowed to prohibit the wearing of costumes stereotyping certain racial or ethnic groups. Now, the data suggests that despite a clear preference for an open environment, the willingness to restrict hurtful or offensive speech shows less tolerance for free expression. Of course, what is hurtful or offensive changes over time. It's unacceptable to say that people of color are genetically inferior, but acceptable to say that support for building a wall is racist. One can believe in border security and not be racist, just as one could oppose the Iraq War and still be a patriot. In 2014, former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice declined to speak at Rutgers University after students objected to her role in the Iraq War. I too opposed the war in Iraq, and I wrote extensively about it, about why it was wrong in various op-eds and in press interviews. But those students, in claiming that their objections were morally right, were saying disagreement with them were morally wrong. The distortion over what's unacceptable is the crux of this debate about what kind of speech should be tolerated. Now, some pundits claim that disinviting speakers is no problem because such incidents are rare. But the problem is that those disinvitations can have a chilling effect, especially when they use violence to stop speech, such as during political scientist Charles Murray's recent appearance at Middlebury College. Campus groups may hesitate to bring controversial speakers if it means extra levels of security. In 2014, International Monetary Fund Managing Director Christine Lagarde had to withdraw as the commencement speaker at Smith College after faculty and student protests. Again, one can argue that the IMF has a damaging influence on the economies of developing nations. But I find it more hurtful and more offensive that one of the most accomplished and powerful women in the world, the first female head of the IMF, and the first female finance minister of a G8 nation, couldn't speak at one of our nation's premier women's colleges. Just last year, conservative pundit Ben Shapiro was scheduled to speak at Berkeley, my alma mater, and was accused of being a white supremacist and a neo-Nazi. Aside from the fact that that was patently false, his commentary is neither of those things, Shapiro follows Orthodox Judaism, and in 2016 was labeled by the Anti-Defamation League as the top 10 most targeted journalists for anti-Semitic harassment. Conflation cheapens terms like white supremacist. They become a catch-all for any person someone disagrees with or someone doesn't like. Just last month, protesters at Lewis and Clark College tried to shut down libertarian feminist Christina Hoff Sommers. They also issued a statement saying freedom of speech, quote, stops when it has a negative and violent impact, unquote. Now, what happened to Rice, Lagarde, Shapiro, Murray, Hoff Sommers, and dozens of other campus speakers is that their conservative political and economic positions were silenced because they were being conflated with offensive speech and even claimed to constitute violence. Some pundits claim that such concerns are overblown, but it should be cause for alarm. Again, one can disagree with their views, but silencing them shows a failure to distinguish difference of degree. After all, it's bad to yell at somebody. It's much worse to hit somebody. But conflation creates an overly simplistic binary that stigmatizes legitimate ideas as immoral and unworthy of discussion. And this gets to my second point. We forfeit more productive methods in our aim for equality. Ideas can become overprotected and underdeveloped, and sometimes in dangerous ways. First, it appeals to emotion. When we ascribe cynical motives to those with whom we disagree or those who think differently, we are absolved of making evidence-based arguments. There's no meaningful discussion. There's no meeting of minds. There's no logical dialogue. One's response doesn't have to gather actual data or marshal historical evidence or make an articulate or coherent point. We can just castigate anyone we disagree with as an ideological enemy who must be crushed, or a knuckle-dragging, mouth-breathing troglodyte who has no equal basis in the conversation. That may feel good, but it leads to my second point. It takes the best ideas off the table right out of the gate. When we have a theological certainty about the truth of our own beliefs and set such high standards for what we're willing to tolerate in civil discourse, we're forfeiting the opportunity to be effective proponents of our side. Constructively engaging differences is tough, but we need to allow ourselves to be vulnerable, because if we don't take risks, we don't learn healthy ways to approach tension. We don't learn ways to exchange views and learn to come with them with confidence and come with well-informed points of view. Or you might even learn some logic in your own point of view, or learn from someone else. We also won't learn the best counterarguments to sharpen our views. As philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote in On Liberty, silencing of opinion is a peculiar evil, because if the opinion expressed was right, then we are robbed of the opportunity to learn. If the opinion expressed was wrong, then we are deprived of the deeper understanding of why. Third, in extreme cases, when groups like Antifa violently resist the rights of others to speak, it's counterproductive because of what's called the activist's dilemma. Social science research shows certain extreme protest tactics that raise awareness, such as inflammatory rhetoric, taking over buildings, rioting and damaging property, reduces popular support for that social movement. In the words of civil rights hero and Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, quote, "The freedom to speak and the freedom to hear are inseparable," unquote. The irony, of course, is that these very folks claim that certain speakers are not allowed to speak because their words are an act of violence. And then they commit violence to prevent that speaker from expressing their views. But the deeper irony is that believing disagreement merits property destruction empowers oppressive police tactics. It is beyond me why some of the very people who decry the criminal justice system and protest how the government claims the right to rule you and put you in a cage want to empower the police, the judges, and the very government that exercises a monopoly on the use of force. People may think of government as a compassionate savior, and that's all well and good. But that neglects that the government enforces its will upon the people through coercive domination. This gets to my final point. Protecting even the most offensive and unpopular speech, left or right, undergirds our protection for equality. In 2016, Hillary Clinton criticized the Boycott Israel movement, accusing it of bullying Jewish students on college campuses and characterizing activists as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism would constitute hatred against people for their national origin. But Boycott Israel is a political view that many left-wing censorship advocates likely share. Also, Black Lives Matter. Some GOP-controlled state legislatures are already arguing that Black Lives Matter should be officially classified as a hate group. One may object to Black Lives Matter and even find them offensive. But do you really think that campus censorship principles should curb their fundamental right to legal rights and free speech? Our history shows that the government's power to restrict speech is an invitation to punish political dissent. Officials like J. Edgar Hoover and Joseph McCarthy used their power to justify punishing civil rights groups, socialists, and communists. Think about it this way. It is a testament to our First Amendment that even the most unpleasant and unpopular and contemptible opinions can be freely propagated and protected. Because at one time, abolition of slavery was unpopular. The suffragette movement and women's rights were unpopular. Racial justice and civil rights were unpopular. LGBT rights were unpopular. Where would these movements be without the safeguards protected by the principle of free speech? In conclusion, when it comes to freedom of speech on campus, we need to be careful because we lack objective criteria for what speech to suppress. We can employ counterproductive methods, and we forget that protecting even the most offensive speech supports and protects our rights of equality. Pundits who claim that free speech on campus is fine and say there's nothing to see here minimize the threat to the principles of free speech and the nurturing of open minds. Thank you.
Ian?
So I've managed to have a tragic technology failure while I was walking up here, so hopefully I can do this without notes. I loved college, and what I loved about college is it's a time when people do foolish things because we're supposed to learn from the foolish things we do. And some of us drank too much. Some of us woke up in the beds of strangers and regretted it the next morning. Some of us, at my college, there was a tradition called the Naked 1 Mile Run, which is exactly what you think it is. There was a guy who climbed a dormitory, literally free climbed a dormitory at my college. And so my point is, some people streak across campus when they're in college. Some people will drink a little bit too much. And some people engage in counterproductive protests that wind up emboldening their ideological enemies. And we should recognize this as a part of the learning experience that college is, but we should also recognize the scale of the problem that we're discussing. I don't actually know that we disagree on this point about the scale of the problem. So, I came involved. There's an organization called Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or FIRE. They are like the leading organization pushing this notion that there is this crisis of free speech being suppressed on campus. They did a little survey a while back of college students. What they found, I think this was a 2017 survey, they found that 86% of college students feel comfortable sharing their opinions in class, 86% feel comfortable speaking outside of class, 91% say that it's important to be part of a campus community where they're exposed to different ideas or opinions. Only 2% say that they would use noise to disrupt a speaker, and only 1% say that they would engage in violent or disruptive actions. The other thing that they maintain is they have a nice little database of all the incidents they found on campus where someone tried to shout down a speaker or otherwise prevent that speaker from speaking. They found 35 incidents in 2017, and that's on over 4,600 college and university campuses in the United States. So we're talking about a small problem. We're talking about a small problem here, and we're talking about a small problem that has not hindered the fundamental role that an education is supposed to provide. Survey after survey shows that college graduates are more protective, more tolerant of opposing viewpoints, more, that they treasure free speech more when they emerge from their college education. And this happens pretty quickly. There was a UCLA study that found that college seniors are 6 percentage points more likely to favor robust free speech norms than college freshmen. So if you care about robust free speech norms, colleges are doing their job right. And this shows up in survey after survey. So I guess the question we got to ask ourselves is, why are we talking about a problem that has arose on 0.74% of American college campuses? And I guess to answer that question, I want to tell you a story about someone that Milo mentioned. Tell you a little story about a man named Charles. So Charles was actually a fairly influential thinker back in the 80s. He wrote a book that was pretty influential in shaping the welfare reform bill that passed in the 90s. But he's best known for a little book he wrote called The Bell Curve in the early 1990s. And if you're not familiar with the bell curve's argument was that black people have, as a class, have lower IQs than white people. And for that reason, government interventions that are supposed to, welfare programs and the like, that are supposed to lift up people of color are destined to fail because their brains are wrong. There's nothing the government can do. That was his argument. He also argued that, although he was a bit weaselly about this, that genes play a major role in shaping this racial IQ divide. And I'm happy in Q&A or later to get into the reasons why that claim is bunk. But I will say that, but again, his argument was that black people and Latinos are genetically inferior. And he said that he's got a First Amendment right to say that. He said some other things since then. He's claimed that benevolent sexism is a wonderful thing. He wrote a book in 2006 which claimed that Social Security is unconstitutional. So in the business that I'm in, there's a word for men like Charles. He's a professional troll. A troll is someone who intentionally takes provocative positions and then relies on the outrage that their provocations lead to in order to enhance their own profile and perhaps lead their opponents into taking foolish actions. And as Milo noted, some of Charles's opponents took some foolish actions. If you're a student and you're thinking about emulating the tactics that they used, don't. And here's why. It has nothing to do with free speech norms. It has nothing to do with whether colleges are serving their mission. The reason why is because Charles Murray makes $30,000 to $50,000 a speech. And he got a lot of free publicity out of this incident on Middlebury College. It was written up in the Washington Post, the New York Times. I don't know how many conservative outlets, Time Magazine. It was all over the place. And he has gotten plenty of additional speaking invites at $30,000 to $50,000 a pop. So this man is playing you. If you think that a good tactic is to try to shout him down, because what's going to happen is he's going to get even more write-ups in even more newspapers, and he's going to get even more money. Now, so that all said about our buddy Charles, I do want to say 2 points of caution. You know, I've urged a degree of forbearance on the part of students who are listening to these speakers. I also think that a degree of forbearance is required on the part of people who are inviting speakers. There are a lot of things you could spend $50,000 on that are a lot more useful to your student body than a speech by Charles Murray. If you attended an American university 100 years ago, there would be not just courses, but probably an entire department on eugenics. There would be a constitutional law class that would teach you that Jim Crow is perfectly legal and that minimum wage laws are unconstitutional. You would get to take an anthropology class, which would praise colonialism for bringing civilization to the benighted people of Africa and India. And and by the way, you could go to the medical school where there would be professors there who taught you that smoking was good for you. So sometimes when ideas are excluded from debates on campus, it's not because there's any conspiracy of censorship. It's not because our free speech norms have broken down. It's because these ideas were excluded for a good reason. It's because these ideas were discredited through the ordinary process of experts examining the ideas and realizing that eugenics is bunk, and realizing that smoking actually isn't good for your health. And, you know, if you are in the position of bringing speakers to campus, you know, you could spend your $50,000 however you want, but I would advise you against bringing the person who wants to tell you about the health benefits of smoking. The last thing I'll say is that if anyone would like to stand up and protest me, please do, because I would very much like to make anywhere near what Charles Murray makes for his speeches, and would love to get all the write-ups in the New York Times. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian. I noticed no one took you up on that, by the way.
Please, I need the publicity.
Right. Maybe we still have some time here. So, for the next 12 minutes, we're going to have Milo give a response, and then for 6 minutes, and then Ian give a response. So, Milo.
Sure, yeah. I don't know if I'm going to take the entire 6 minutes. It is certainly, as we both agree on the panel, it's an issue that is blown completely out of proportion, which is why I mentioned earlier that, you know, far from college students and their depiction as pearl-clutching snowflakes, in fact, college across the board opens minds, and it actually opens students to both liberal and conservative ideas. So why is it that we're seeing this increased, these flashpoints? And what does that mean when we see these increased flashpoints? I actually think those increased flashpoints, and to your point as well, this is actually the issue, is that there was a poll conducted, I believe just last year from Pew, that showed that the majority of Americans agree with Trump on this, that there's this sense that the American people and the American public has grown oversensitive, overly sensitive. Even though we're more open than ever, we're exposed to more opinions and viewpoints, we have awareness and knowledge about different cultures here and around the world, we seem to be totally oversensitive. And it's that perception that gets blown out of proportion. The long-term issue, and I actually think this is partly the rise of Trump, is that even when those views are, we have an open discussion, we have an open debate, and, we can eliminate the teaching of eugenics, and we can eliminate the teaching that smoking is great. 4 out of 5 doctors agree that Lucky Strike is a great cigarette. What does end up happening is that when you do exclude those opinions, you don't weaken the resolve, you strengthen it. And it's what's called the spiral of silence. And this is the silent Trump supporter. This is what we saw throughout 2016. The notion that Hillary Clinton was bound to win. She was the inevitable candidate. She's the most respected person. She has all of these qualifications. It's going to be a total cakewalk. How could she lose? Because the people who disagreed with those viewpoints, they felt lambasted, stigmatized, and silenced. So they didn't feel comfortable expressing their views openly. So there is a chilling effect when we believe that we do have an open discussion and we do have open debate. Oftentimes that's not the case. And people with differences of opinions feel that they can't express themselves openly and that they have to suppress their own viewpoints.
Ian?
I doubt I'll take the full 6 minutes either. I do want to draw a couple of distinctions. One is a distinction between censorship and social shunning. So it has always been the case that if someone says really offensive things and like the people at your lunch table don't like the things that the person is saying, you tell them to go away. And that strikes me as a perfectly acceptable norm that we can enforce. We can choose we can choose who we want to associate with, and we can shun the people that we view as having offensive viewpoints without having, whether it's a university administration or the government, get involved in that, and that which would be an entirely different thing. The second thing that I think I would describe, to go to your point about how there are new tensions arising now. But I think these tensions are arising now because the power dynamics in society have changed. The difference between the world we live in now and the world that was depicted on Mad Men is that women actually have power in the workplace now. And the sexual harassment was bad then. It was just that no one could do anything about it because the people who were the victims didn't have were not in a position of power where they could do something about it. A lot of these difficult conversations you're having on campus about racist speech or sexist speech, or how these various social norms should be policed, they're coming from the fact that there is now a critical mass of black students on campus, or a critical mass of Latino students on campus, or a critical mass of women on campus in a way that wasn't true 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so things that were wrong 50 years ago are still wrong. It's just the case that the people who were on the losing end of it actually have the ability to stand up and say something and, and have a place in the conversation about what should be done about it. Now, does that necessarily mean that should be handled by university administrators? In most cases, no. In most cases, it can be handled through social shunning. In some cases, sexual harassment in the workplace is illegal, and for good reason. Sexual harassment on campus is something that can be handled by university administrators. But the reason why we're having these tensions come up now is because of the progress we have made as a society. It's because you no longer have wide swaths of people who have to sit and endure things that 40 or 50 years ago were just taken as a given.
All right, thank you. I'm now going to read you a couple of pieces of instruction. First is, in this CWA session, we will utilize both the CWA app and the note card system, the old-fashioned way, to receive questions from the audience. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand to request a note card. And we have people here who have note cards, and a pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly. If you are a student, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. Second, I want to read you is about donations. And you thought you were going to get out of this.
Please pay us.
Yeah. Before we turn to audience questions and answers, we would like to just quickly mention that CWA is funded in part through generous community support. We hope you are enjoying this wonderful event and would consider a small contribution. It is easy to do so through the CWA app. Just click on the Donate tab. All right. So while the cards are being passed out and while you're writing questions, I have a couple questions for the panel. The first has to do with something that neither one of you brought up, but when I read about these events on campus, always seems to be lurking in the background, and that is the idea that there are third-party groups who like to see tension on campus. And I was just curious about what you thought about that argument and the role of such groups in the tensions that exist when free speech is practiced on campus.
Well, I think there are certainly third-party groups. In some respects, you saw that with Antifa, especially in the Berkeley, Oakland area. I would call them, back when I was at Berkeley, would be professional protesters, whether it be climate change, Israel, abortion. They would always be out there. So I think there are certain third-party groups. I, as a student at Berkeley and still having friends who live in the area, I mean, it would be unconscionable to try and just destroy my alma mater's building. So there are certainly other people in that group who resorted to violent means to get their points across. The power of these groups, that is unclear.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are trolls on all sides, and sometimes the trolls aren't the people getting paid to give the speech. It's the people who are trying to call attention to themselves, either from the audience or, by, engaging in other, more violent tactics. Yeah, and I mean, as a general rule, I think that these tactics are counterproductive. Again, this isn't a point about the First Amendment or about like what the rules should be. This is a point that, like, when you are the one who is on TV wearing a black ski mask and throwing a chair through a window, you are losing the argument. And if you want to win the argument, you should consider a different method of debating.
And this is the activist dilemma that I got to in my remarks, that social science research actually shows that this undermines popular support for certain social movements, and when they resort to violent tactics, taking over buildings, resorting to lawless actions such as Antifa's.
Yeah. I mean, if anything, if we could get more meta, you now have you now have groups posing as Antifa.
Oh, God.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like it's going to get very meta. That you're going to have Antifa people posing as right wingers, posing as Antifa, and you can go down this rabbit hole all you want.
Tea Party Antifa.
Yeah, but I mean, I think that this is a small phenomenon, and it's largely done by people who don't have a good idea how to productively engage in political debate.
So at the risk of inviting such problems, we've managed to have a number of speakers here at CU Boulder and have managed to avoid these things. Is there a reason behind that, or are we just flying too low below the radar here?
Well, I know at least as of last year, the Colorado State Legislature, they put a stop to these free speech codes in the state. And I think Tennessee and also Utah has done this. So there is a push and a movement to decrease the number of these free speech zones. In fact, there was a student in LA who was cited for trying to give out Spanish language versions of the Constitution because he wasn't in a free speech zone that was the size of like 3 parking spots, and he didn't have a college permit to give out and solicit literature. I mean, they're ridiculous examples of this. And even though the number of schools that have these free speech zones are in decline, still 90% of universities and colleges still have these free speech zones. So it's an issue that's getting dealt with and is getting better, but it's still an issue. Colorado, though, I think, I actually saw this in the stairwell. I took a picture of it because I was so impressed. And I think it's the ethos of this university that really helps. I saw this in the stairwell. It said, "Live the creed, respect the rights of others, and accept our differences." Live by that. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, I would go with a more basic explanation, which is just that the overwhelming majority of people just don't view these tactics as productive, and, the system works. And the system works without any top-down control. I mean, as I said, there's only 35 documented incidents across 4,600 or so campuses. So most people, when they come together in a room and, sit in an audience much like this one, are respectful. And, maybe that's because they have an inherent code of respect. Maybe it's because they realize that they're just going to look like an asshole if they stand up and start screaming. But for whatever reason, I think that the people generally know how to behave and will behave and will behave respectfully in this kind of a setting.
I would add one thing, a slight disagreement. I think there may have been a reason why these free speech codes were put in the first place. I mean, maybe now we've gotten a little more civilized. I would argue that we have. I don't think there's been this mass wave of anti-Semitic and pro-white violence across the country. If anything, we've become much more tolerant over the last 50 and 60 years. But at some point in our history, we decided that we wanted to have free speech zones on campus. What that purpose was, it's unclear. But the notion that, okay, well, we don't need them now. Of course we don't need them now, but they were put there for a reason, and we need to see them dismantled.
I mean, I guess I could offer a very tepid defense of free speech zones, which is that, sometimes when it arises, it's because, it has nothing to do with free speech norms and everything to do with just like logistical organizing. You have like a building that a lot of people are coming into, and you have protesters, and it's very common when you have a large protest to just say like, okay, this is the place where the protest, and it's not in front of the door because people need to actually get in that door, and it has nothing to do with suppressing anyone's speech. It just has to do with logistically making sure that the event can happen. So like, I don't think that crowd control is necessarily offensive to the First Amendment. I think that it can become offensive if it goes too far. But like, I think there are legitimate reasons to say like, okay, here's a rope and here's the door, and you're welcome to protest, but please stand behind this rope so people can walk in the door.
Certainly, though, not if it's on the other side of campus and the size of only 3 parking spots. And, oh, by the way, you have to petition the university 5 days in advance.
Well, that would be something else.
Yeah. First question from the audience. What is your opinion about inviting members of groups such as the KKK, whose purpose is clearly inflammatory?
Well, speaking as an intersectional female minority, I would say that it's repulsive, it's repugnant, and sadly, I disagree with what they say, but I'll defend to the death the right to say it. It's offensive speech, and I support those who want to protest the KKK.
Yeah, I'd say this is a problem that probably doesn't need a rule to solve it. I mean, like, we're at a conference right now. There's about 100 speakers at this conference, and there's a whole lot of people who were not invited to this conference. And like, there's a whole lot of people, there's a whole lot of perspectives that are not represented at this conference. And often that's not because of any intentional decision to exclude anyone. It's just that you only have but so many slots. There's a whole lot of viewpoints out there, and you have to pick and choose. And so, speaking opportunities on campus are a limited resource. There's, on any given campus, there's only going to be but so many people who get to be brought in to speak, and but so much attention from the students to those speakers. And so, when I'm distributing a limited resource, I would not be inclined to distribute it to the Ku Klux Klan. And again, I don't think that needs to come from like any kind of legal restriction. I think that's just good sense. That when you are distributing something that is limited, you have to make judgment calls, and I think that inviting the Klan to speak on campus would reflect poor judgment.
Maybe I took the more difficult answer with that question. I thought that it was more of would I defend their right to speak, not necessarily would I invite them. Of course, I wouldn't invite them. That's the easy way. Of course I wouldn't invite them.
Could have dispensed with that one quite quickly. Okay. Second question. How do we distinguish free speech for diverse ideologies as necessary for a healthy democracy from authoritarian speakers successfully creating movements that help them rise in power?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but the Supreme Court doesn't distinguish that. What they do distinguish is imminent lawless action. Speech that's intended to incite violence, imminent lawless action, imminent lawless violence, not necessarily authoritarian viewpoints or socialist viewpoints or Black Lives Matter viewpoints or any sort of viewpoint discrimination.
Yeah, I mean, that's the First Amendment standard. So, like, if, like, Richard Spencer, who's a famous white supremacist, like, gets an invite to speak on a campus, then he has the same First Amendment rights as people who have other viewpoints, because that's what it means to have a First Amendment, is you have to tolerate the bad speech along with the good. But again, I don't want to sound like too much of a broken record, but we make choices when we invite people to speak in venues. And if someone has an authoritarian viewpoint, you could choose not to extend an invitation to them. If they do arrive on campus, again, a lot of these folks are professional trolls. I mean, what they want is the conflict. And so if you're dealing, with a Richard Spencer type figure who feeds off of the publicity that comes from being shouted down, the single best thing you can provide him with is an empty room.
All right. What role does the media have to play in the questioner asks censorship, or lack thereof, in such speeches of protest in the community. What role does the media have to play in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a large question. It's a large question. I mean, if there is a big protest on campus, especially if it involves violence, then that is a newsworthy event. And like, even if the media is playing into a provocateur's game, like I think that it is generally the proper journalistic judgment to cover such an event. I do think that there are opinion journalists. Like, part of the reason we're having this conversation is because of a number of very high-profile opinion journalists have taken this fairly small issue and have acted like it is a major issue. There's a single week where 3 different New York Times columnists wrote columns. I think all 3 of them mentioned Charles Murray, and 2 of them mentioned Christina Hoff Sommers, and like, I mean, maybe Bari Weiss thought that was the best thing she could have devoted her column to that week, but I suspect there were other things that also happened that week, and the other 2 columnists could have maybe written about something else. I mean, I'm a working journalist, and what makes the job hard is that you're constantly making judgments about how to spend your own time. Issues often don't get covered, not because of any kind of bias. It's because I had 5 other things to do, and that just, either I was too busy when this came up, or I was too bored by it, or I didn't recognize that this was something important until like much time had passed, and I realized, oh, I made the wrong call by not covering it. So I think that there are a lot of very hard questions about news judgments, and they often have to be made on a case-by-case basis as things happen. But I do think that this is one of those issues that receives media attention that is disproportionate to the scope of the problem.
I think that certainly the media does do a lot to amplify certain discussions in the political discourse. Excuse me?
Sells newspapers.
Sells newspapers, exactly. And I think that is sort of what we're seeing now in I would describe it as sort of infotainment, celebrity gossip style news covers that we've seen of the 24-hour news cycle, that there is a proclivity to amplify these views and these stories that don't necessarily have a great deal of traction. As I mentioned earlier, that survey that showed that even though we're becoming more tolerant as a society, the perception is that we're growing overly sensitive about so many issues. I would not doubt that it's highly correlated with this media factor of amplifying these sort of divisions that we have within society. And there is also the issue I mentioned earlier, which is the spiral of silence.
All right. This is a juicy one. It seems the majority of stifling of free speech is directed at conservatives, despite the fact that most university professors lean to the left. Why dismiss the rare times that conservative voices appear? Oh, let me try this again. Why dismiss that the rare times conservative voices appear, there are such attacks on free speech? I'm not sure I understand that last bit, but I think you get the gist of the question. It seems the majority of the stifling of free speech is directed at conservatives, and the questioner is arguing that indeed most of the faculty are left-leaning.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a few things. I mean, if we're really talking about, a problem where, the numerator is 35 and the denominator is, however many speech, hundreds of thousands of speeches go on in all of the campuses across the country, then I'm somewhat dismissive towards this because it doesn't happen very often, and I would be dismissive no matter who was being shut down. Now, my advice, as I gave before, is that I would advise students against these tactics, because I think that they tend to, they tend to serve the interests of the person who is giving the speech. To the extent that there is a conservative leaning to this tactic, I think it's because there is more of a market for a certain kind of conservative troll. in the sense that, there isn't a Breitbart of the left. There is, I don't think that all conservatives are interested in trolling, but there is a readership and there is a segment of the population that, finds right-wing trolls to be something that they find entertaining. And so and so there's already that market, and they come and they provoke people, and some people get provoked, and then they get more speaking fees. But, again, we're talking about, a handful of incidents here, and, my overarching advice is I wouldn't replicate these tactics because don't feed the trolls.
I would say that the faculty certainly are not immune to these, what some would call outrage campaigns. In fact, I'm living in Philadelphia right now, and Drexel University is based in Philadelphia. And there was an incident, I don't know if you all remember, this happened last year where a Drexel associate professor tweeted, quote, "All I want for Christmas is white genocide." Unquote. Now, he's a white professor, and he said it was satirical. And the university investigated him. They barred him, and he said, quote, "We are all a single outrage campaign away from having no rights at all." And there are other outrage campaigns just like this, and it's not just affecting students who are conservative or guest speakers who are conservative, but also faculty who may say something, off the cuff or as a joke or something satirical. This happened similarly at Fresno State, at Trinity College, at various universities. There's also the incident at Evergreen State College. You may recall this. This is actually a very egregious example of where the administrators asked the white people to leave campus. And a professor objected, saying that one's right to speak and one's right to be should never be based on skin color. Students accused him of racism. They demanded his resignation. They yelled when he tried to talk, and they blocked when he tried to leave. So even though these incidents, they may be 0.0.02, it doesn't matter. The fact that they happen at all, I think it raises our cackles. We get very offended. There's something about it that seems un-American. Even if we don't agree with the person, even if we don't agree with what they're saying, we understand that we should defend that right for that person to speak.
Please read the online questions also.
Oh, do I have them? I should. Someone
have an iPad?
Yeah. I don't have one up here. I want to be fair to this questioner, because the gist of the question is, I now have read it a few times. Do you think that there is a dearth of conservative free speech on campus, or an imbalance, if you will?
I would say that most of my professors were liberal, left of center. That's only speaking from personal experience.
I mean, I might as well just lean into this question. I mean, we are in a moment where the man at the head of the conservative movement in this country is a goonish former game show host. So, it is in fact true that, like, if you just look at opinion polls, like, young people tend to lean left, and that's, if you bring in a bunch of young people and make them college students, then, like, they're probably going to reflect the demographics of young people as a whole. But, like, I think that, I don't think that there is an absence of theoretical conservative ideas that could be attractive to academics. But I think that conservatism is going out of its way to appear unattractive right now. And given that fact, I could see why highly educated people would find it unappealing at this moment.
I like this one. Concerning free speech on campus with the CWA, isn't requiring people to text questions a manner of censorship that screens and avoids difficult questions instead of letting people line up at microphones? What would you like to see, Milo?
Well, thank you for asking that question. I don't mind questions asked via an app. I do think it is a little faceless. It's anonymous, obviously. It creates an additional barrier to the question and the person who's answering. But hey, I think it is discriminatory in the sense that people who don't have the app can't ask questions. Mic drop.
Yeah. Ian, did you want to weigh in on that, or?
Oh,
You want to let that one go?
All right, yeah.
All right. Well, let me ask you this one. This is second. Is there any line that the desire to allow for free speech should not cross?
Imminent lawless violence. I mean, that is, is asking legally or just in terms of personal preference?
Either way.
I mean, there are hard questions in the law. I mean, you know, sexual harassment in the workplace and on campus is something that, like, that the law does reach. And there is often a verbal component to sexual harassment. I mean, sometimes there is actionable sexual harassment or racial harassment where the verbal component is the only component. And so I think that, you know, the consensus that, you know, the courts have reached a consensus that when that conduct is sufficiently egregious, it can be, you know, there can be an action taken against the people who engage in it. Now, the bar for egregiousness is pretty high, and is higher than, you know, walking around quoting the bell curve. But, you know, there are hard questions in this space. You know, I don't know that, like, I think that questions like how do you deal with sexual harassment on campus would have to be an entirely different panel topic, because I think that that's something fundamentally different than what we're discussing here. But, you know, there is extreme conduct that is largely, you know, speech-based that, you know, when it reaches a certain level of egregiousness at some point, I think it's appropriate for administrators to step in.
And I'd also say this is something that's sort of been danced around and we haven't really dealt with it explicitly, is that we're only really talking about public colleges and universities for the most part. But even private universities, I think except for a few like BYU, I think all, even private universities and colleges, they make a statement saying that they will protect the rights of freedom of speech. So even though they're not necessarily protected by the First Amendment, they do say in their charter that they do protect free speech.
Well, that's an excellent segue into the next question, which I think you've begun to answer. One observation is that these protests are more likely at elite colleges. Why is that?
I don't know if that's actually the case.
Yeah, I don't know if that's been shown.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that to be weaselly. Like, I'm not saying I don't know that that's actually the case. To me, no. I mean, like, I genuinely do not know if that is true or not.
I don't know if the data supports that. I mean, maybe it is, but I haven't seen any data to show that.
Okay.
Great question, though.
Is it sufficient to let the law of supply and demand solve this? If there isn't demand to attend a speech and few people go, is there harm?
I think that's the idea, and that's sort of the what we were both getting at, is that you deprive these people of oxygen. I mean, one of my go-to ideas in terms of who I really just outright loathe would be the Westboro Baptist Church. I mean, just the most cretinous group of people. Well, now I'm going to get tomatoes, I'm sure, or, you know, tweets or something. So I think in that respect, when you look at, like, that is like the most egregious example. So if they come to your university, don't try to give them more oxygen. Don't try to give them more attention. You know, throwing chairs, the inflammatory rhetoric, saying that their speech is violence. I mean, that just attracts more attention and gives more attention to their cause. Again, don't feed the trolls. Don't feed the troglodytes.
Yeah, I think that goes to the other side of, like, the question of the role of the media. Like, the press behaves in predictable ways. Like, I mean, as much as, you know, I said before that, like, we often have to make difficult judgments about what we're going to cover. It's pretty predictable that, like, if 1,000 people show up on Berkeley's campus and throw a bunch of chairs through windows, that, like, the press is going to cover that. And I think that, you know, one tactic that people are intentionally trying to gauge a provocation do is they hack the press. You know, they do things that they know are likely to get them that kind of publicity, and that's you know, they feel that sort of publicity serves their goals. So, to the extent that you can, and now I'm sounding too much like I should be at Silicon Valley, but if you can disrupt the hacking of the press, then, like, you know, I think that's going to accomplish a whole lot more than than trying to have a louder protest.
Yeah, and I would also argue, you know, go to the event. Use reason, use rationality, marshal evidence, make a compelling statement about why you disagree. I mean, as I mentioned in my remarks, I was vehemently against the war in Iraq. If I knew that Condoleezza Rice was going to Berkeley to speak, I would go. I would sit in the audience. I'd wait for Q&A. I'd stand in line. And I'd ask the most cogent and compelling question I could get Marshall to make my point. I think that's the best way to counter these views, especially if they're on the cusp. But we're not talking about Westboro Baptist Church, but those with whom you disagree with, but may be unpopular.
Yeah, I think that point about it being on the cusp is important.
Yes.
You know, if it's Richard Spencer, give him an empty room. You know,
Yes,
if
exactly.
it's Condoleezza Rice, I'd love to get the chance to ask her a few questions.
Exactly. I mean, don't let stupid people mess up with your own rationality or reason. Think logically still.
That's a T-shirt. It's a student question. There are two existential threats to American democracy. One, nuclear war. Two, government obstruction of individual civil and political liberties. Where do you draw the line? Is censoring not a very slippery slope?
There are only two threats. I can think of quite a few more right now. Well, so there's a difference between, so I mean, Milou, you hinted at this earlier, but I guess there's a bit of a hierarchy here. So there's government suppression of speech, and the First Amendment has extraordinarily robust shields against that. I mean, unless you have imminent violence or some, and like a lot of the areas I brought up before, like sexual harassment, like there really hasn't been like a full articulation of the First Amendment rationale for it. But what's written into the doctrine is that like the conduct has to be especially egregious. So when the government is doing it, the bar is very, very high. And then as you move down in tiers of power, I think that you can have more exclusion. So I think that a university administration has to make decisions about which speakers it invites. And I think that there are statements that a professor could make in a classroom. They would probably have to be really, really bad, but there are statements a professor could make in a classroom which would justify disciplining that professor. And then, you move all the way down to the social group. And at the level of the social group, you can decide you just don't like a person. And that if they come and sit at your lunch table, you're going to get up and go elsewhere. So the way to think about it is, the more ability that the institution has to the more coercive power it has. I think the more institutional checks you want on it. The more that you're just looking at people acting as individuals, then, you can tell someone what you think about them and walk away.
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily going to destroy America, but I do see that there's been a shift in how we talk to one another, in the sense that one can disagree with someone on tax policy or immigration policy or healthcare policy. Now the disagreement has become a referendum on someone's moral character. I think that's the dangerous line of reasoning that we go down, and I don't think that's healthy for our society.
I think we can agree on that. Another question from a student. If you censored people with a minority view, messages like MLK Jr.'s would never have been normalized. You demonstrated that we are often incorrect as a society. Don't we risk silencing the truth and harming our society?
Hear, hear, I'd agree with that. So, I think that was mentioned in my remarks.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that these are really hard questions. These questions about who you want to give a platform to, and I don't know that I can articulate a rule in a sentence, or if I had to write regulatory language, or if you gave me 10 minutes with this microphone, I could really come up with a way to draw those lines. Because on the one hand, you're right that there are a lot of people who had very unpopular viewpoints, as Martin Luther King's views were throughout his lifetime, with the majority of the nation, who we now view as people who were correct. At the same time, I think that eugenics, for example, was rejected for a good reason. I apologize if I sound like I'm being weaselly here, because I think that it is very hard to articulate a specific objective standard that you can use to distinguish between the person with an unpopular political viewpoint that winds up becoming really revelatory, and the person who believed something that was rejected for a very good reason. Now, again, the remedy for the person who was rejected for a very good reason isn't to, lock them up. Yeah,
Maybe the debate between MLK and Malcolm X, perhaps. I mean, the idea wouldn't be to silence Malcolm X because we disagree. I'm just thinking about on the cusp of views that may be unpopular and may be silenced or censored versus those that are unpopular and then are embraced in the broader political discourse. And it's tough. It is really tough. Trying to think of an example.
Yeah, I'm here, if I was going to dive that deep into my civil rights history, I'd be more inclined to put Stokely Carmichael on that, across that line than Malcolm X. But my point is simply that these are hard lines to draw, and that doesn't mean that you censor a person by using coercive power against them. But if I were a campus speech organizer in the late 1960s, I would invite Martin Luther King to come to my campus. I would not invite Stokely Carmichael. And I think it's hard to articulate why the objective standard for why one person falls on either side of the line. But these are judgment calls that I think people make all the time.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm allowed to let you, yes.
Why do you all think there are so few students in this room?
Aha!
It might be a class.
Yeah, it could be. What do you think, student? Jessica's here.
Yeah, let's point our finger at one random student.
She's my ambassador.
Let's make her
You
very
must
uncomfortable.
speak on behalf of everyone.
Free Huey.
You carry the burden of all students as a class at this moment.
Well, why do you think there aren't students here? Do you think they disagree with the subject of the?
I'm mystified. I'm totally mystified. I would have thought this room was full, would have been full of students.
Especially with what is the bond understood.
Oh, what happened?
If you guys are reading any of the editorial going after the CWA,
Blow up here.
Oh, what happened?
There's a squabble over $20 million between the provost and the student government.
Really? About this conference?
No.
Apparently, there was money that used to be in control of the student government, and I think the provost decided that he wanted to control the money, and
And he's backed up.
Kids, yeah.
for speakers bureau, for speakers.
How would that impact this, though?
It doesn't.
Oh,
but,
okay.
yeah, do you want to ask a question too? Go ahead.
Red herring.
What?
I'd love to throw out a yes.
Go for it.
Yeah.
Is at a university like this, lots for the community, Conference of World Affairs is a big deal. For the student body, it's not emphasized to go to this because it was less important to get multiple sides of the story, multiple opinions on all these broad subjects, and more important to get your learning done and answer specific questions based on specific classes.
Thank you for that.
That hurts.
The truth hurts, doesn't it?
As the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, I really hope that's not the case. I mean, we are, hopefully within our classrooms, allowing for free speech, wide open free speech.
Well, that's not necessarily the point that I'm going for. It's
Yeah.
as a student, I've asked a lot of my friends if they're going, and a lot of reasons, then a lot of students are saying, I wish I could go, but I can't because I have to write all these papers this week. And I have to go do my 300 pages of reading tonight, and it's not such a high, I wish more teachers required students to come to this stuff.
I think we've just.
I think this is a good CWA panel, John.
I think this is what they call.
How do we, have we gone too far in college education in terms of occupying the students' time? Do they not have enough time to take on interesting topics like this? That's what you're saying, and I take your message. I think that that in itself is a dangerous thing on a college campus.
so I want to especially since I'm
topic.
yeah,
No.
especially since I'm just wading into this from afar. I don't want to tell you how to run your campus, but I guess my question for the students is how much of that is that it is April, because I remember when I was a student, April is busy and say January is less busy in terms of work?
April's insane.
Oh.
Sorry. It logged out on me. I have another question for you, a written comment. Please comment on your view. Do things like safe rooms and limiting offensive speech empower or re-victimize those who perceive themselves to be oppressed or victims?
My personal opinion is that it doesn't allow the person to confront what was the triggering mechanism in this issue. I have close personal friends who have been traumatized by various matters. Some of them have PTSD, and emergent therapy has helped them. I've noticed with my friends who don't confront their issues that it almost reopens the wound when they broach it and don't confront the issue. So I think there could be a problem of, again, what I mentioned earlier about having an idea overprotected and underdeveloped, and retreating to a safe space is understandable, certainly, on an intuitive level, but I think it could make someone more reluctant to confront the issues that led to their problem in the first place.
So I think there's this weird phenomenon going on. I'm like, and this is something that I think is a genuine problem on campus, which is that a lot of things that are actually very ordinary are being dressed up in this weird kind of leftist academic jargon that makes them sound like newer and I think more ridiculous than they are. You know, like when I was in college, we had a safe space. I would just go back to my dorm and hang out with my friends. Yeah, and like, I mean, like the idea that sometimes, you know, you're stressed and you're upset about something that someone said or did, and you just want to be amongst similarly minded people and like feel comfortable for a while before you go back into the world. Like, that is something that human beings have been doing since we first started gathering together in caves. You know, that it's not a new concept. And yet, like, I mean, I think there's just so many things where, like,
Microaggression.
yeah, where like very, you know, very ordinary concepts that if I just explained to you the thing that, like, if I just described it to you, it would sound like the most banal thing. And for some reason, there's an effort to put labels on these very banal concepts that I think makes them sound much, you know, much stranger.
It almost pathologizes these things.
Exactly.
It creates it as more of a psychological issue than what it is, and it almost exacerbates that issue in some respects.
Yeah, and so like when I was, you know, I went to college in the 90s, and like not only was there like the informal safe spaces, but like there was the Women's Center, and there was the Black Student Center, and there was a center for LGBT students, and like it was fine. And like, you know, no one felt that because like someone might like in a moment of like when you know they're feeling traumatized want to retreat to one of these places, that they were doing something that was the least bit abnormal. And like I think we have created this vocabulary that has made it seem weirder than it really is.
Yeah, I think I hate to say the victim mentality, but I think it is a what?
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay.
I
I just did that to what I just said.
I just once again screwed up.
I think there is this victimization and this victim mentality, and we can become so immersed into it that it creates and relives this resentment, and one cannot move past it almost. But I think I'm going to answer that question with a question, and I'm going to throw this to the audience and to my fellow panelists here. This isn't something that's discussed, but freedom of association. I was thinking about it when you mentioned, you know, for instance, at Berkeley we had the Black Student Union. There was, you know, LGBT on campus. There was the Latino student group on campus. I wonder where this is going to go moving forward when it's this idea that I think Harvard has done this, where you can't have a male-only group. You know, they say that you can't have an X-only group. Then where does freedom of association go in that respect? I mean, we have the idea of freedom of association. We can freely associate with those with whom we like. But if there are either campus codes that say, okay, well, you can't group together as male only or as Latinos only or as blacks only, is this an issue? Is this a problem? Do you think that this is just a passing fad?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, again, I think there's hard questions here because, like, I mean, I grew up in a southern city where there was the country club that you had to be white to belong to. And like one function of that was that there were a lot of business meetings that happened over golf, and if you weren't white, like you did not have access to that level of business.
Social capital.
Yeah, and you know, and then there was a dinner club that you not only had to be white, but you had to be male to belong to, and there would be, you know, like women were allowed there as guests, but they had particularly good food. It was considered a desirable venue to have a business meeting. And if you were a woman who wanted to convene people for a dinner at this desirable location, you had to find a male colleague who would sponsor your event who was a member of the club. And like that has very real consequences that I think we want to eradicate. You know, at the same time, like, you know, I mean, I have a group of friends and we're all men, and like every now and then someone sends out an email and says like, hey, let's go get together at Will's Beach House or something like that. And like, I don't think that there's anything particularly offensive at that, and like, we're not the Illuminati, and we're not, you know, just, you know, and we're also not like in a professional setting. So like, you know, like by not having our wives present, we aren't denying them opportunities. And so I think what's hard about university campuses is that they're this hybrid of both social communities and professional communities, where, you know, you come here for professional training and professional credentials, you meet professional, you make professional contacts here, and, you know, to the extent that you have discrimination on campus that is excluding people from professional opportunities, then I think that's a matter worth addressing. But at the same time, like, I think that there is a meaningful distinction between the type of social gatherings that also have professional implications and the kinds of social gatherings that are just social gatherings. And it's, you know, it's hard for me to know, having thought about this now for all of 3 minutes, where that line is.
Okay, another question. The small percentage, so I have two questions here I'm going to combine, but the small percentage, Ian, that you've mentioned of disruptions that have occurred given the total number of college campuses, do you think that protests against conservatives has had a chilling effect on invitations to conservatives to speak on campus? For example, liberal commencement speakers far outnumber conservative ones. So it's a small number in part because conservatives are being chased away.
I mean, I think, you know, as I said, I think that for certain speakers it has had the opposite of a chilling effect. I mean, I think that there's actually a really good book on this, where like one of the case studies I think was done at UC Boulder. I can't remember the name of the book. I think it's called Becoming Right, which studied this campus and studied Harvard's campus, and looked at the tactics that student groups use in order to, or that specifically conservative student groups use in order to like recruit and like be relevant on campus, get their message across. And one thing that it found is that for many of these groups, bringing in a provocative speaker and like having there be a big blow up and like, you know, getting, you know, outraging, you know, the liberals on campus and being that center of attention was something that they viewed as a desirable thing that helped them. Now, the other thing that the book concluded, which I thought was very interesting, is that one problem with that sort of tactic is that it marginalizes the sorts of conservative speakers that I think you do want on campus. So, like, I mean, like, I start off by criticizing, you know, Charles Murray as a professional troll, but there are plenty of people who are writing in the space of race and politics from a conservative perspective who have, you know, perspectives that I think belong on a college campus. And I worry what was probably happening is that the sort of conservative speakers that I think really do have valuable contributions to offer are getting pushed out in favor of these better known, more provocative speakers who I think have less to contribute. And, you know, to the extent that people are upset about, you know, university campuses leaning left, you know, I think if conservatism is putting its worst foot forward, then that's going to encourage more universities to lean left.
Just, there's a student question on there that I'd like to get back to. One of the questions that was on there that I can remember, should Milo Yiannopoulos be invited to speak on campus?
I'll let you take it.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see why not, given what we've been discussing. His tour was called Dangerous Faggot, correct?
I don't remember.
I believe that's what it was called, and I think that is in and of itself triggering to very, very many people. I mean, that's a word that is so verboten in the political discourse today. I would have no problem with having Milo Yiannopoulos, but again, he's a provocateur. He says very provocative things. Is he correct on certain issues, on certain policy issues? There are certain policy issues I may agree with him on. There are certain policy issues where I find him egregious on. But I think that, again, these coercive tactics, this activist dilemma tactics actually serve his purpose because he wants to sell books, he wants to get ratings, he wants to have the publicity. So I would have no problem with having him on any campus. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, even the group that I detest the most, Westboro Baptist Church, I mean, it just makes me shiver. That'd be fine.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll turn the question on its head a bit and go back to what I was just saying, which is, if you're a campus conservative group, why would you want Milo to be the face of your organization? I mean, like, you know, the man makes conservatism look so unattractive that like, I don't understand why, you know, why you would choose to associate with him as a marketing tactic. Like I mean, there are...
Well, someone could say the same thing about someone like Bernie Sanders. I mean, someone could make the same. It's in the eye of the beholder. This is where we get into a little dangerous territory.
I mean, perhaps, yeah. I mean, like, yeah.
Or Ralph Nader.
I will happily concede that there exist left-leaning speakers that like make liberalism look bad, and like, you know, and I guess, like, you know, I have been, you know, a person on campus who led a liberal group that brought in liberal speakers, and I tried to avoid those people because I wanted my side to look good. And, you know, and so, you know, again, like, this isn't a point about free speech. I'm just mystified by why, you know, if you're the college Republicans and the message you want to send to people is, you know, you should vote Republican and being a Republican is good, why would you pick one of the least appealing figures in your movement? I mean, there are other people you could choose who are more likely to convince people that they should vote Republican.
I think it's red meat to the base. It's who you're trying to attract, right? And this is an interesting sort of philosophical question. It's who you're trying to attract by inviting certain speakers. Are you trying to get people on the cusp of a certain disagreement or debate, or are you just trying to throw red meat to the people who already agree with you? Perhaps those college Republicans wanted to invite someone like Milo, or, you know, someone like Christina Hoff Sommers, or someone like Charles Murray, or someone like Ben Shapiro, because they already agree with those positions. They're not looking to the campus left-wing activists and having them, you know, come to their side or come to that debate. They probably didn't understand or didn't think that it would provoke such a wild reaction on the other side that the other side would go completely bananas if you invited Milo Yiannopoulos. But certainly that feeds into someone like Milo Yiannopoulos' overarching strategy, which is to sell more books, to have more publicity. But the reason why those campus groups invite those speakers is probably because they already agree with them.
Yeah, I mean, sure, but I mean, I'm just thinking about this, I mean, as someone who's played politics for a while. I mean, like, I have a realistic understanding of how Hillary Clinton would have performed in 2016 if she had been up against a normal candidate. Like, you know, when you put your least appealing face, I mean, maybe sometimes you win, but like, I mean, yeah, I mean, and sometimes it feels good to get red meat. But I mean, when I was, you know, when I led the law school Democrats at Duke, like, I did it because I wanted to convince more of my classmates to vote for John Kerry. And so I was going to pick speakers that would convince them to, you know, that would make John Kerry look appealing. And, you know, I mean, I don't know who the left-wing equivalent of Milo, especially who it would have been in, like, 2004. but I wouldn't have invited that person just because.
Cindy Sheehan, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who that person is, but I would not have invited them because it would have undermined something that I care dearly about.
Well, the issue with Cindy Sheehan,
Last
for those who know, is that she was a rabid anti-war, Iraq war protester. And she basically said that, America's setting up gulags, really egregious stuff. But I would imagine that on the left, a lot of people looked up to her and said that, okay, she was criticizing the Bush era and the Bush regime. And her son was killed, right, exactly. But then to characterize everyone on the left as, okay, well, she's just Cindy Sheehan. But to many people, they like Cindy Sheehan. And so it's in the eye of the beholder. For some people, they gravitate towards that. They sympathize with her, and they said that she was an opponent of the Iraq war, and we should look up to her. On the right, someone could say, well, I don't even know why they would even invite someone like Cindy Sheehan. I mean, she's like the worst representative of the left. Well, it's in the eye of the beholder.
All right. I'm going to have to draw it to a close there. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
That was fun. Yeah, that was great. Yeah. I'm happy that was your first discussion. Thank you very much.
One of the questions I had to skip was, should we invite Trump?